Yeah.
Why don't I let you guys discuss together where you're at this point, and then we could recap what we had discussed in our previous meeting.
Yeah, definitely. Cool. Alex?
It's on me. Well, first of all, we discussed, we went through so many parts and concepts and debates on different subjects. So, but I guess I can sum it up to being very kind of focused on kind of few topics like language or mediums, like as proposal for works, mediums as language or new mediums such as internet, playing with internet algorithms or pure cinema or but we went through many places, so it's difficult to synthesize now everything in 2-3 minutes, but we even with we were attached to fluxus, and we did an experimentation actually with one fluxus score, which Sydney started, and then I responded to it, and then there was discussions around currency and what can currency mean in today's world, subtle currency, data capitalism, all this sort of things, the permanent interaction that we are kind of faced with. And at some point we arrived at the idea that it's, as artists, as conceptual artists, both of us, Sydney and myself, we, everything leads up to some sort of form. So what would that form would be in at the end of the day, after all these discussions? And there is always this danger, I may say, that nothing is satisfying, that nothing holds properly what the mind comes up with. So then this is also something that I personally encounter in my work, this kind of duality, that there is one aspect of the thinking, and I guess to some degree I kind of inserted into the discussion with Sydney this kind of problematic of thinking something conceptually, and then another problem would be the actual materialization of the work. Yes, and Sydney, do continue if you feel like adding something.
Have a good week.
Just to go a bit further back, we started thinking about this idea. So it came from this idea about thinking about language and the way that it functions as a container. And so we originally I found this clip I've been fascinated with for a few years of Keeping Up with the Kardashians, and Kanye West plays this game he calls a board game, BORED. And they go through Webster's dictionary, Pocket Dictionary, and they say the words are positive or negative. And this happened in social, it's on social media, but also it's viral. It's on TV. So they're defining words as positive or negative and thinking about barter, basic. And so I think doing that in a public way really establishes, kind of a hierarchy or equality associated with these words, or the ability for the words to change. So we kind of took that, we found on Amazon actually, because we both needed to have a copy. So I guess that goes back to the generic a little bit. So we went on Amazon and we found the first 4 pages of the dictionary, and we kind of did the same process and then put it through different algorithms to decide on the word acquit, which is really funny because the relationship to Kardashians, and that was a word that had to do with the fluxus. And so thinking about the stability of that word or what that word means and investigating that. And I actually have up our drive of our responses kind of that happened when we started thinking about acquit. So like this is a piece I made, a response to like Fruit Sonata. You know, and like the way this functions is like you're on your phone and you screenshot and it gives you a selection. You know, so just thinking about that. The original one I think is like play baseball with a banana or something like that. So just that was my response, and then Alex screenshotted it and he responded, and his response was this. Let me know if you can't hear it, please.
The important thing is to move in the direction the best that you can. The important thing is to move in the direction the best that you can. Remember, move to the best of your ability. Remember, move to the best of your ability. Remember, move to the best of your ability. Remember, move to the best of your ability.
So there's that, and then the last one we kind of have in here is this that you found, right? Like this is a found piece. So we have this mixture of like found, I guess everything's kind of a found object in a way. But yeah, definitely this idea, sorry, of like absurdity and, you know, tools extraction, I think is definitely something we have leaned towards a lot in our practice so far. And yeah, now it's the form, place, and this idea of like the objects, and like this idea of like a text or like a vessel, or language being a vessel and that being like inhabited, or how that can like change. Also was really interesting. We found out the word acquit kind of used to be used a lot, is not used as frequently. And there's like an inverse relationship in terms of forgot the specifics, but just the way that language functions and when it's used versus what it's not. And oh yeah, the archaic meaning of acquit is different than like its current usage. And this idea of like you used to be able to like discharge your own debt or like take responsibility, and now it's like an outside force. So like interior, exterior conversations as well. Yeah.
Well, it was good to see those. So you have some, would you consider those prototypes kind of?
We were trying to figure that out, right? Yeah.
Well, you're both working in the form of video, right? You're both working in it's kind of, and also appropriation, you know, détournement, and the generic container, like appropriating a generic. Yours is kind of like a rebus, Sydney, like a game, while Alex is more like a presentation. It's more like you know, like a video piece. And you know, just to recap, because we had a long conversation before this, what we talked about was aspects of non-standardized language derived from the Webster's dictionary via chance operations, randomized operations, using the algorithm against itself to arrive at something that's having more of a subjective meaning based on your mutual associations that you're bringing to that. And I made the comments that there are aspects of exhaustion, which is a word that was important to you, and I think it was in your initial meeting, I'm not sure, but and that how our relation to the generic container as an exhausted one might not necessarily be negative, but it might be a starting point for potentiality. Now it's not very abstract, but seems like our earlier discussion was more organic, but so yeah, so, and also like object-oriented ontology, how does the object inform, how does the literal limit, the object limit embodied object have a relationship to the digital platforms? How does language operate as kind of an artifact, kind of a ruin or a relic of, I think you call them error poems, Alex?
Sort of, yeah, sort of like that. Yeah, it was referred directly to the 404 error that you encounter on the internet. So, and the messages that are attached to this error, yeah, which I guess has very much to do with what you were saying about the algorithms going against themselves, or being kind of driving as a driving force to something else.
You know, there's a great book on this topic that you may or may not want to be interested in getting. It's called, there's another very important French philosopher called, well, to me anyway, called Francois Laruelle. And he has this whole idea of a non-standard philosophy. And he comes out of a continental philosophical background of interested in the generic. And there's a great book, not by him, but it's an interpretive book, because sometimes his text can be kind of, Laruelle's text can be kind of hard to get through. But the philosopher theorist Alexander Galloway, who teaches at NYU, he wrote a fantastic book called Laruelle Against the Digital. Mm-hmm. And the reason why I'm bringing up Galloway in this book is because he has a very determined relation to the digital, and it's not positive. He acknowledges all the positive aspects of it, but he has kind of a negative relationship. He has an apprehension of the digital, you know, subsuming our subjectivity via the algorithm. And he posits in this book about Laruelle that it might be a way out. It might be a way out because the specificity, algorithms function with, like, you know, specific information, and the generic can kind of confound it. I mean, one thing, you know, one generic operation that I've done in the past is I've taken a section of like a famous painting, and I looked it up on Google Images, and if you take a small enough section, it genericizes the response. So if I take a section from like a Manet painting, the Déjeuner sur la herbe or something, it comes up with all these responses of bushes, you know. That has nothing to do with the original input, you know. So the thought processes that they're instigated by this Manet painting, they move towards the generic unconsciously via the algorithm. But I think what Laruelle and Galloway are talking about, the generic, is conscious, like a conscious application of the generic against the specificity of digital algorithms. And that seems to cleave somewhat with, you know, the term acquit, you know, because there's kind of and your term, Alex, too, of enroute. And Bartleby the scrivener's refusal to participate in the copying or the copyist's task, or just being a mute instrument in the copyist's, the algorithmic projection. So these are some of the things we talked about before. I just wanted to kind of recap those a little bit. The other important philosophers were Giorgio Agamben, who wrote a great essay about the Bartleby story, and Jacques Rancière, who in his kind of groundbreaking book called Mute Speech, he talks about the generic container. He talks about the novel as a generic container, the novel form as a generic container. But he extrapolates that from he extrapolates from that the viewer or the participant enters into a generic container, or say like genre painting, there's a more immediate access into a genre painting than there is into a historical painting from like the 19th century, because everybody can relate to like, a bowl of fruit, but not everybody can relate to like Napoleon's, downfall at Waterloo. So he makes this, Rancière in mute speech makes some very interesting arguments for the generic container, not as like a negative thing, but as a positive thing, that it's a way to access the, circumvent the specificity of the historical event. So like if you think of historical paintings as algorithmic, delivering like this kind of like, this kind of programmatic narrative or programmatic idealism, and the still life just kind of relating to like, the present. That's a kind of a good analogy to, I think, to think about how one might have a stance in relation to the mediator. Another artist that comes to mind is Corey Archangel. Are you familiar with his work? But he hacks programs. So again, I'm going to return to the question that I brought before we started recording, is that maybe you should make a decision or a non-decision about your stance in regard to that, or you just leave it open-ended.
Sorry, stance in regard to?
What might be considered like the subsumption of human ontology or subjective ontology by the algorithm. We have our own games. We can make up our own games. They're nascent algorithms, I guess, because they're based on a randomized thing, like you guys already did. I guess my question is like, kind of like Hito Steyerl, I think, kind of taking a kind of Marxist political stance somewhat with regards to the new subjectivity in the digital.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Also, I don't know, there's this idea of like a more connected internet, like Web3, which I don't think really exists yet, but it's a work in progress. But this idea of like using, artificial intelligence to like benefit in a different way, or this like decentralized internet, where like you exist, it's this idea of extraction, and I keep coming back to where, like you exist in this way in this platform, or like, you have like this interest and like this niche interest, and like you can combine, like you don't have to be everything everywhere, like this idea of like omnipresence. Yeah, that's interesting. But also, this idea of like what an algorithm, like currently our algorithms define as like human versus like, like subjectivity and like everything. So
you mentioned the term extraction quite a bit, and I think that's a fascinating term. If we just go back to the history of modernism and the idea of like the picture interrogating the viewer, that kind of old cliche. But to some degree, there is this aspect of the subject is being mined, right? And there's an ecology of extraction, which one can either participate in willingly, or most of the times probably participates unwillingly. Again, so this gets back to the idea of like, what's one's stance in regards to unwilling participation in extraction.
that's the bad faith part, right? Yeah.
I don't know. I don't want to come down like on one moral side or the other. I have my own personal ideas about that. Like I know that if I spend too much time like online, my literal body gets uncoordinated. So there's actually there are actually impacts of spending a lot of time online. We get rewired, our minds get rewired, and our body starts to lose its somatic memory, and the implications are staggering, actually.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't really have anything to say to that. Just thinking, yeah. But I think
we could just go back to the idea of play too. I mean, like, we're artists, and invoking Fluxus is an idea of play. Free play. See what happens. But maybe like informed with all of these ideas. Maybe all of these ideas are the point of exhaustion.
yeah, I was thinking like incorporating those pieces that we showed you, those our drive, like, and thinking about that in terms of like these objects that we're making. And also I'm potentially interested in like sound, but also like, in like these texts, and like having that just be influenced and that be kind of like the, attached, but like also like maybe like very deep in there. But also this idea I think about like when you're talking about like Rancière, I think about Duchamp too, and like the art coefficient, and that relationship, and like how things are placed differently throughout time. And also time, I think, is something that we have to think about a lot too. Um, in terms of like endurance. And I know earlier in conversations, Alex, you were talking about, this might have been the first conversation we had about exhaustion, about how when you do a performance and you have like a score, like you don't say a score, you call it a something else. But this idea of like following it very strictly the first time, and then you get to like the fourth time and you're like more free through the constraints. And we were talking about like Hito in relation to that, like Lovely Andrea and everything. So yeah.
The idea of sound is interesting because that brings in another sense. It's not just the scopic. I mean, a lot of what's online is like, it's scopic, right? It's scopophilia. It's flat. It's visual. It's a visual language. Most of what we're imbibing in. So using other senses, I think, is one way to kind of circumvent that scopic regime. And this goes back to like Marshall McLuhan. McLuhan would talk about how when you watch TV, you're like physically being kind of like engaged. It's not just like passive. You're actively being engaged. So this goes back to your idea of extraction. We are actively being engaged bodily by the media, by the medium. And I guess, by invoking different senses, we can make that more of a round kind of experience, and or acknowledge it. Acknowledge that this is a phenomenological interaction that's going on. It's not just information flashing by, but our body is reacting to it.
Yeah. Also Mel Chen did a piece on Melrose Place for like 3 seasons, like a conceptual art project and like the background of Melrose Place. And that definitely ties into that idea of like phenomenology. And, because we are picking up on all those things, we're just not like seeing it right away, and I also think about like Haroon Farooqi in terms of that. Haroon Farooqi, like the forgot what the name of, he is like it's fire or something like that. I'll look it up. But this idea of like things being seen, like all these like phenomenological occurrences happening that we don't like directly acknowledge, but they still are happening and influencing like our subconscious in the way that we process. So yeah, I think like sound, I've been thinking about I don't know, we could have like different aspects, but I like this idea of like all these different embodiments that aren't may not be physically present, but are still there. Yeah. Or visible to the eye.
Both, right? Or potentially, right? I mean, music is very powerful as a vibration, right? And even spoken word in a certain way, if it's spoken word is sound, right? Uh, so yeah, and so the opposite of extraction is kind of insertion, right? Like you're talking about Mel Chin. And I was just recently reading Mel Bachner's book about his essays, which is fantastic on this whole subject. And he and Robert Smithson very early on, like, did this project where they inserted an art piece into an art magazine, and it was just made from appropriated text, and it was a complete fiction that they just inserted into this art magazine, thinking that that was the art object. Like they didn't have to make a literal art object. It was like, early conceptual art. So it's similar to what you're talking about with Mel Chin. Like if one inserts oneself into that slipstream, one is actively, responding to extraction, right? So you got your work cut out for you. I do love these props, though. I love this idea of the prop and the insubstantial sculpture, or the insubstantial embodiment only made in thinking about how it's going to be used in the digital environment. Because that brings up volume, like that chair that you made has volume, as does our bodies, but is it sustainable volume, right? If we want to talk about sustainability, I'm less interested in the idea of sustainability the way it's typically used, like in a liberal politics, than I am in terms of the resilience of the body as sustainable. In our specific conversation, anyway. So when I think of those props, I think of them as insubstantial and as unsustainable. But then they get sustained within the digital, in digital perpetuity. So there's your time element.
Yeah, like they could not exist physically at a point, but they still are like documented and existing. Yeah. Yes.
That's what you were talking about with Constance de Jong. Like the documentation becomes the piece.
Mm-hmm.
So do you think that your form is going to take like a digital or multimedia form? Okay. I'm really looking forward to seeing the results,
But maybe this would be a question to you. How would you, how are you kind of approaching, or how do you approach the notion of exhaustion in your work, or how do you make it present, or is it something that is just conceptually in your head, or are you actually physically working with exhaustion as an actor would do? Because actors do a lot of this part of their technique to free themselves of the mechanical movements and all this sort of stuff, and that kind of it's removed from them to some degree by being tired. They're
right.
Tired. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So I can answer that very specifically. But I'd like preface it with this great quote by William Kentridge. So William Kentridge started out in theater, and then he tried something else, and then he tried something else. But his quote is, "I was reduced to being an artist." Mm-hmm. So, I'm 62, and I've gone through a lot of different phases in my career and changes. And in the last decade, a little bit over a decade, I've been painting paintings like these, which there's an aspect of art historical reference in terms of, say, like Malevich and like a minimalist heritage, but kind of like in bad faith. They're kind of bad faith paintings. They're not idealistic in any way. they're bad faith in the sense that they're not going for a holistic reference, but they're kind of exhausted abstractions in my mind. They're exhausted abstractions. So they're rather inadequate, like in terms of their existential vibe. So I'm interested in how far I can push that inadequacy. Mm-hmm. So I could show you. I could show you a couple more here. It's like, so this painting here. I forget what it's called. Some of the titles are telling too. This painting is. So this painting is actually this painting in the back is called "Arrive Exhausted." So when I title my pieces, there's a poetry to them. This painting is. Yeah, I'm forgetting the titles. But I derive my titles in an aleatory way from contemporary language. So items in checkout. So items in checkout is something you encounter in Amazon, right? But I'm also interested in the poetic double entendre of like my paintings being items in checkout. They're checked out. You know what I mean? So there's a very strong ludic, playful aspect to, but also very serious aspect to the exhausted abstractions that I'm involved in. The irony is that, it takes a lot of work to make an exhausted abstraction. So, but again, I think it's powered by, my work has always been powered, all the different permutations of my work has always been powered by a conceptual approach. Recently, it's led to kind of more aesthetic approach. So like Arrive Exhausted, that painting behind me was very difficult to organize harmonically, like the colors. It's a very Kafkaesque endeavor, actually, because I work to make these, these very generic forms in a random way, intentionally, which is already paradoxical. And then, when I choose the colors, sometimes I'm choosing them subjectively in terms of subjective memory. But then when I put them, into this generic container, they lose their subjective memory. And so I'm like really aware of this constant game between like intention and inevitable, in order to make these objects inevitable, I have to accept the inevitable failures of reaching my goal. So it's related to Beckett, it's related to exhaustion, it's related to absurdity. But Beckett's a great example of somebody who made a very rich language out of like exhausting the lexicon, Of course, he brought this kind of Irish thing to it too, but so there's an aspect of humor in my work too. I like humor as a subversive force. I picked that up very early on from Robert Smithson's writings, which are very funny. And when I read them in undergrad, and I was like, "What the hell's going on here?" And I kept on rereading them, and I finally got it. I was like, "This guy's like, he's just doing a piss take on like art theory, And I'm like, "Yes, I can do that for the rest of my life." Yes.
So you think humor and exhaustion are very much tied together, or they should be?
Well, for me, it's a way for me to reconcile, the implications of exhaustion, especially as I get older,
Yeah.
You have to have a kind of humorous distance to the whole idea of exhaustion in order to make the work. If I intentionally try to make exhausted images, like they won't be engaging. It's like if you try to write a book about boredom, it better not be boring, because no one will read it.
Yeah.
But so like really great to meet you guys. I love you guys. I love the way you think. I'm like right in there with you, and I'm really psyched about what are you going to come up with?